Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
So Alex Lee, known to I think many of us in the room, received a BA in classics from Stanford, with a minor in computer science. He's now a PhD student in classics, working on a dissertation on image making and mathematics in the argumentative structure of Plato's Republic. And he has thought deeply and read widely on language acquisition. He got interested in it as both as a language student himself and also then trying to teach languages to others. And he has taught a considerable number of times in the introductory and intermediate sequences in Greek and Latin in the Department of Classics here at the U of C, and has also participated in the Commentaculum Latinum at the University of Kentucky, which is a summer conversational Latin seminar, and he's done that for the last 3 years. So he has experience both as a language learner and as a teacher with some of the methods that we'll be talking about. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out for this. And the basic purpose of this workshop is to try to just encourage some reflection about how we teach languages, especially when we're teaching what people generally refer to as dead languages, or languages that just aren't used or spoken that much anymore. I guess I wanted to start with a few sort of disclaimers and warnings. I know that people have strong views about a lot of this stuff, and I've certainly talked to a lot of people in the past, and I myself have found myself on various sides of many of these issues. And I think that one of the dangers is that there are a lot of assumptions built into the way we think about language teaching and language learning and language acquisition. So what I hope to do is to just try to bring those out and make them more visible through this discussion. And also, I think that we all have our own personal experiences with language learning and how that's gone. And I think that it's important to reflect on those things, but also to try to remain open about them. And I know for myself, at least over the years, I analyzed my own experiences in different ways, depending on sort of new experiences and maybe new theoretical explanations that one can have for how one makes progress in language proficiency. So anyway, that's basically the point here, and I'm going to talk mostly about Latin because that's what I've been teaching most recently, but Greek will also come into it. Hopefully this will apply more widely to other languages that people are involved in teaching. Another thing is that I have my own views currently about how this can be done effectively, but I don't want this to be sort of me marketing a particular set of views. What I want to do is sort of bring out what I think is some interesting perspectives on it, and then to sort of bring them up for discussion. But I can't completely mask what I believe, but I'll try to mark it out as we go along. And then also with my own teaching, I regard that it's not like I can say, okay, I'm really an excellent teacher of Latin and Greek and yield these wonderful results and so forth, but it's something I care very much about, and it's very much a work in progress. So that's basically where I'm coming from with this. And I think that another thing that I should mention is that some of the stuff I'll talk about, it's fairly common among modern language teachers, and I'm sure you've encountered it either in studying modern languages or maybe you're just familiar with some of these things. So it's not like any of the stuff that I'll be talking about is particularly new or innovative, but I think that it's things in my experience that at least a lot of classicists just don't think about or care very much about, and so I think they're worth bringing up. So Brandon and I thought that it might be nice to start off with just a very, very brief set of introductions, so people could say, what their position is or what department or school they're in, and what languages they have taught or are anticipating teaching, just something very quick like that. So I thought maybe it would be good to get just a general view of that. So we could start over here perhaps.
Sure. I'm Sarah Yearney. I'm a PhD student in Hebrew Bible in the Divinity School. I've taught Latin and Greek and tutored in Hebrew and will almost certainly teach Hebrew in the classroom at some point.
And Knappel, Bibliography for Religion and Philosophy at the library. I currently teach the online course at Spurs College.
And she taught me Hebrew.
I'll go. I'm Jonathan Sawyers. I'm a fifth year in New Testament and Early Christian Lit. I imagine if I ever find a job, I'll hopefully be able to teach Greek with some flavor at some point, and God forbid Hebrew, perhaps, as well.
I'm Jordan Skornick. I'm a PhD student, also at Hebrew Bible.
I'm Dave Manalfi. I'm a PhD student in History of Christianity, and I tutor people in Latin and Greek.
Joseph Steiniger, a PhD candidate in philosophy of religion. I'm just here to see what the language people are up to.
Ron Listafel, I'm a PhD candidate in the New Testament. I've done some Greek teaching in the past.
I'm Kelly Gardner, second year PhD student in Hebrew Bible. I currently tutor a student in Hebrew, and I'm sure I'll be teaching Hebrew and maybe Greek in the future.
I'm Leon Wash, first year in classics, and I have taught Latin and Greek.
I'm Tobias Yogo. I'm a PhD student in classics and social thought, and I've taught Greek and Latin.
And Bart van Massenhoog, I'm also a PhD candidate in classics, and I've taught Latin and Greek at university.
I'm Robin Whitaker. I'm a PhD student in Bible and New Testament. I have taught Biblical Greek, and I will be teaching Hebrew.
I'm Aaron Polliner. I'm a PhD student in theology. I've never taught language in the classroom, but I've tutored Latin and Greek and Italian.
I'm Katerina Lamperis. I'm second year in theology, and I've taught unexpectedly Russian.
I'm Walter Shandrook, sixth year student, PhD student in classics. Taught mostly Greek, but I see myself teaching the Latin comprehensive.
I'm Stephen Parkin. I'm a third year in comparative literature, work mostly in the classics, and I've tutored Latin, and I also have experience teaching English as a second language.
I guess we'll go to this side. I'm Jeremy Brightville, fifth year classics grad student. I've taught Greek and Latin and tutored in a couple of modern languages, Spanish, Hindi, Italian, things like that. Long ago.
I'm Marcos Gouveia. I'm also a fifth year in the classics department. I've taught Latin and Greek.
I'm Brandon Klein. I'm also a New Testament student in New Testament and Christian literature, and could teach conceivably Greek, Hebrew, or if the stars align, Latin.
Hi, I'm Tina. I'm art history, and I'm just generally interested in the language of pedagogy.
My name is Kate Hartman. I'm in history of religions. I do Tibetan, Sanskrit, and Hindi.
I'm Sean Hannon. I'm in history of Christianity. I've never taught a language, but if I did, it would be Latin.
Cam Ferguson, PhD in New Testament and Early Christian Lit. I'm with Jonathan on the Hebrew. God forbid I actually teach it one day. But Latin, Greek, and Coptic will be my group.
I'm Cassie Jackson. I'm a fourth year in classics, and I've taught Greek and Latin, but I've also worked with Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs, Coptic, and Demotic, so would like to teach one or more of those, probably not Demotic, at some point in the future.
I'm Will. I'm a first year in the classics department, and I used to teach Latin, Greek, and high school.
Is that everyone? All right. And I'm just kind of curious, so when it comes to these ancient or dead languages, who here has tried to do some active use of the language, like spoken stuff? Okay, so spoken biblical Greek or Latin. All right. Well, so I think the way I'd like to start out is just considering what it is we're trying to accomplish. I think that as language teachers, we can probably converge on a set of things that we view as our main goal. And so I thought I would start by quoting. So this is from some of you may be familiar with this, Reading Greek by the Joint Association of Classical Teachers. So this is a reading course in Added Greek. And here, this is from the foreword by Kenneth Dover. He says, there is one criterion and only one by which a course for the learners that a language no longer spoken should be judged: the efficiency and speed with which it brings them to the stage of reading texts in the original language with precision, understanding, and enjoyment. And I think that makes sense to me. I think most people would probably agree with that. And so I think that we could state our goals as, one, we want to teach people to read texts fluidly and precisely. So without too much trouble going through the text, with a good pace, but also with precision. And then we also want people to read original texts or authentic texts as soon as possible. We want to get them up to speed doing that efficiently and quickly. That raises the question of what an authentic text is. And especially with, say, Latin, this is especially troublesome, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then something that Dover doesn't mention here, but which I think, at least among classicists in my view, in my experience, is something people care a lot about. We want students to have a detailed knowledge of the language. So they need to have detailed linguistic knowledge, grammatical knowledge, things like that. And then I'll move on to a second quote here. This is from the APA published this edited volume called When Dead Tongues Speak, and I think this is quite interesting. It contains a range of perspectives on people who are a little bit dissatisfied, let's say, with the standard grammar-heavy grammar translation approach to language teaching in Greek and Latin, and it's edited by John Gruber Miller. And from his first chapter, he writes this. He says, when I was first teaching, I was more concerned to cover the grammar and finish the book, and then I thought my students would know Latin and Greek. After all, time is short, so it was best, I thought, to focus on what the book had to offer. There were paradigms to be memorized, vocabulary to be studied, exercises to be completed, and passages to translate. Once my students completed these hurdles, I assumed, or at least hoped, that they understood the new grammar well enough and had learned enough vocabulary to move on to the next chapter. Okay? So, with a book like, those of you who have taken Latin here, familiar with Keller and Russell, with a book like this, with the workbook and so forth, that's kind of how it feels from the teacher's perspective. And then he goes on to say, somehow I expected my students, after memorizing forms, studying vocabulary, and practicing sentences, to be able to read and understand almost magically Latin and Greek. And if they could not read yet, I usually gave them more of the same, exercises that focused on sentence level syntax. Instead of helping my students learn to read, understand, and interpret Greek and Latin within their cultural contexts, I was focusing on accuracy at the sentence level. One aspect of what linguists call communicative competence. In short, I was practicing a theory of language teaching and learning that did not fit with my goal of helping students read Greek and Latin fluently and accurately, of appreciating it as a living language. So here we begin to see some dissatisfaction with what happens in these kinds of classrooms, and I guess, I assume this is the case with many other languages, but especially with Latin and Greek. This is my experience learning it in large part. The shock that happens when you move from doing the exercises and reading sentences that highlight grammatical constructions to trying to actually read an original text, it's quite difficult to handle that, I think. The standard approach, I think we could just sort of break it down like this. So we could say grammar rules. Memorize vocab, exercises and drills, and these are usually individual sentences without any context to them, right? And they're not at all focused on meaning or communication, but on illustrating a grammatical construction. Okay, and then we also look at readings. Analyze grammar. And then finally, this is optional, I guess. You can translate from English to Latin, etc. So you can do prose composition, which would typically also be individual sentences. Okay, so this is just to establish kind of how things tend to go. And probably in your experience, this overlaps a lot with what you've seen, but maybe for some of you, you've encountered different kinds of approaches. So, but when we get to the discussion, it'll be interesting to see how people think about this and what they've encountered. The next thing is to consider how successful we are at meeting these goals with this approach. And so I just thought of a few questions. If we look at someone who's in, say, their third year of Latin here, or an incoming graduate student in classics, presumably competent, right, at Greek and Latin. The question is, can the student pick up and read a classical Latin text without a grammar and lexicon at hand and just read through it? A second question, can the student, when reading the text, comprehend it without translating? Is the student doing this without thinking at all in English, but with full comprehension? And then the third question, which I guess is just something that bothers me when I encounter it sometimes, is can the student read Latin aloud clearly, accurately, and expressively? I think I've encountered many instances where people can translate texts very well, but to actually read them aloud is actually very difficult. And I find this strange. But, so those are just some questions, and I would say that, I don't know what your experience is, but when I think about myself as an advanced undergraduate, or as a graduate student coming in here initially, and for many years probably after that, I did really badly when asked those questions. So, and I started studying Latin from the 7th grade in high school, and then almost every year in high school I studied it. And I also did Greek for 3 years, and then in college I did 3 years of each, including prose composition in each. And then when I came here, I still wasn't able to do those things, which I think is quite bad. And then I have two further questions. One, without the further impetus of ongoing academic studies like graduate school, how many students who have started studying these languages go on to make progress with them? Second question, do students who want to make progress have a clear path forward? Are they being equipped with the knowledge, skills, and awareness of resources that are out there to let them continue developing proficiency? Okay, do they have the basis? Do they have the skills? Do they have the the guidelines? And do they know about what resources are there? Are we, basically the question is, are we teaching them to become effective language learners? And that's another area where I feel, at least in my own training and things I've observed, that things are quite deficient. Okay, so now I want to move on to talking about assumptions. So hopefully this will not seem too unfair. So this is a possible characterization of the standard approach. And by the standard approach, I mean, what we call grammar translation, okay? Which is what you see, like, Keller and Russell is a prime example of this. I think Wheelock is also, Moreland and Fleischer. And then on the Greek side, Hansen and Quinn. There's now Learn to Read Greek. There's Mastronardi. So you guys are probably familiar with a lot of these on the Latin and Greek side. So I just tried to look at a few of these things. So the ideas built into this. One, the ability to read and comprehend depends on linguistic knowledge. Two, we need to cover grammar in an introductory course. The grammar treatment should be as comprehensive as possible. Three, translation from the target language to one's base language and the reverse is an important and useful skill. So from Latin to English. Next item, languages such as Latin and Greek are dead, such that oral and colloquial use is more of a game or diversion than anything else. We don't have time or use for this in the class. 5, we must delay gratification. That's to say, students need to invest a lot of time up front memorizing vocabulary, paradigms, and grammar rules, which most people don't consider enjoyable. There are a few, but I think they're a very small minority. And they benefit greatly from the current system, I think. I'm actually one of them, right? I think a lot of us are. Yeah. But we want to serve our students as a whole well, right? So we should strive as early as possible to read authentic texts. And here I put texts from classical antiquity. This question comes up a lot on some of the Latin discussions online that I see, because the thing is, when people say authentic texts, I guess they're usually thinking like Cicero or Virgil or things like that. And everything after that gets kind of ignored, but then, and they don't want to read things that are more modern or things that are sort of manufactured or artificial. But it's very hard to make a clear distinction, actually, because if you look at someone like Erasmus, right, Latin is not his native language, and it was no one's native language at the time, but I think we would consider his Latin to be authentic in a way, right? But then the Latin that's contained in a textbook, like you have excerpts from this, and we'll look at later, like, so this Lingua Latina per se illustrata, right? This textbook has a lot of made-up Latin in it, but I don't think that there's anything wrong with reading this, but that's kind of my sense of this coming through. But yeah, so that's an important question. What do we mean by authentic text? And then the last item, students will be adequately equipped to tackle literary texts in their second year of study. if we can't get them to this point by then, students won't be motivated to even take these languages. So there's a question here both of what kind of competence do we expect them to get at a certain amount of time, within a certain amount of time, and then also how are we motivating them, right? Students, I guess, when they look at Latin, they think, okay, this is either a requirement or it's, this looks cool, I want to read Virgil, or something like that. And if we can't realistically say, hey, you'll be picking up and reading Virgil by the end of second year, then they might not want to do this anymore, right? So there's this question sort of at play. I don't know, actually, recently with students I've had at the UOC, I don't see a lot of strong interest in actually reaching the ability to read certain authors or certain texts, which I find a bit strange, but that's also something to think about, and we're really interested to hear what people have to say.
What do they want?
I try to do this thing at the beginning of the quarter where you ask people, okay, so why are you doing this? What are you interested in? And they just sort of say, oh yeah, I know, maybe I'd like to read Augustine or Cicero or something like that, but then they don't really have a specific thing. Yeah, Mark?
A lot of them say, I did it in high school and I was good at it, enjoyed it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's like a perverse adverse selection problem because it's like the people who are successful at memorizing paradigms and I don't know, doing these little grammatical exercises who approach it as kind of a game are willing to continue playing this game, and it's sort of an end in itself.
Yeah. So that's my characterization of this interview, which I don't mean to. I mean, it could be something of a caricature, right? So, but it's just meant to highlight some of the assumptions. So counterpoints to this. Number one. So just answering each item. So we could say the following. One, there is an important distinction between learning and acquisition. That is a distinction between possessing knowledge about the language versus having the ability to use the language. Okay, so we could call this language proficiency versus language knowledge. Okay. The second item, we could say linguistic knowledge is not a prerequisite for reading. Indeed, reading proficiency should precede linguistic knowledge. Okay, so you don't need linguistic knowledge in order to have reading proficiency. And then just to use the terms that will come up in a quote later, we could call this usus versus doctrina. Okay? Number three, we could say there is an important distinction between translation and reading. So this is on the question of translation. And one might claim that excessive reliance on translation actually hinders the development of reading ability. So that would be reading versus translation. Okay, number four, on spoken language, you could say oral and colloquial use of the language might in fact contribute greatly to fostering reading proficiency. So I think that should be an open question and one that people take into consideration. So this would be relevance or use of spoken language. And by spoken, I also mean active use. And then five, we could say the comprehensive coverage of grammar is not necessary in the first year, but beyond that, or at some later point, it needs to be addressed. Okay? So this would be, you could characterize this, let me go right here. You say, get it right now versus eventually. Okay? So do we need students to know all of the rules and observations in Keller and Russell by the end of the first year? Or can they do that later? And actually, I was talking to some students just today who were saying that they found Master Narni very difficult to use in the first year, but subsequently used it as a review or a revision text and found it extremely useful at that point. And I think that was my experience with Master Narni too, actually. Okay. So that's just by, and then number six, authentic texts are not our only way to motivate students and keep them interested. So that raises the question, well, what would be the other motivations or things that get you interested in language learning? So I'll come back to that in a bit. Now, so the way I'd like to organize the rest of this is in the readings, I don't know how many of you had a chance to look at this, but one of the items was this short article called Stephen Krashen and the Classical Languages. So maybe you had a chance to look at that. It's not in your handout, but it's the reason I suggested this is because he describes very succinctly the 5 hypotheses about second language acquisition that Stephen Krashen has advocated for. And I should just say up front that this is just one possible theoretical basis, and you don't necessarily, I mean, it's not necessarily the case that all the parts of it are accurate, right? And it remains controversial, so there's been a lot of research done that undermines parts of it or reinforces parts of it and so forth. But I think it's extremely useful because it stands at such a contrast to what a lot of us tend to do currently, so I think it's good for highlighting the differences. And then just for myself, I find this to be extremely helpful as a theory for explaining how language acquisition works. So I don't necessarily buy into it completely, but I find it very useful. Just to quickly run through it, there's first the acquisition learning distinction. So I'll just try to describe these briefly. If you've read a little bit about it, that would be helpful, but and if there are questions later, we'll talk about it. But the acquisition learning distinction is basically that these are 2 separate processes, that learning is distinct from acquisition, okay? Acquisition is more of a subconscious process that happens where you could, when people say you're picking up a language, that's what he means by acquisition, okay? And the result of acquisition is acquired competence, which is also subconscious, okay? He says, we're generally not consciously aware of the rules of languages we have acquired. Instead, we have a feel for correctness. And so with your native language, this is probably the case. When people ask you to explain why something's right or wrong, it's oftentimes difficult, but you have a feel for it. And the same can happen with a second language that you've acquired. Learning, by contrast, is picking up knowledge about the language. So it's linguistic knowledge, okay? And this happens through knowing the rules, being aware of them, being able to talk about them. So that's the first hypothesis. The second is the natural order hypothesis. And there's been some interesting research that backs this up. Basically, it's the idea that when you're acquiring a new language, for each language, there's a somewhat predictable order of structures that you acquire. So in English, I think, simple past forms with ing at the end get acquired very quickly. And apparently, for some reason, third person singular and s gets acquired very late. So even people who have been speaking English really well for years and years and can write exquisitely, right, in conversation will drop that s. So it's something that gets picked up very, very late. No one's done research into Greek and Latin, what the order of acquisition is there, but that might be helpful. I mean, what that would say then, right, is if you have a textbook that's structured according to a certain set of rules, it's unrealistic to expect students to fully acquire one rule that you've somewhat arbitrarily picked ahead of another. Okay, next is the monitor hypothesis, which says that it tells you what the relationship between acquisition and learning is and what the use of learning is. So if we care about acquisition and acquired competence in a language, then what does learning give you? Well, the monitor hypothesis says that it creates this editor or monitor. And when you're producing language, you come up with a language, and the monitor will fix it for you. So when you're writing, it's a lot more correct because the monitor is much more active. When you're speaking, it's not active, really. You're just speaking in conversation. And so you see this, if I write someone an email in Latin, I work through it and it's a lot better than it would be if I had just spoken it. But when you're in Kentucky in the summer talking with people, you hear all sorts of awful Latin coming out of people's mouths, right? But it gets better over time. And that's how it is because your sort of subconscious, immediate production is not quite right yet. But for myself, I think that mine was definitely a lot worse with the first year I went than the previous year that I went. So that does improve over time. And it's not something where you almost have to shut it off. Otherwise, you can't speak with people. You can't communicate with them. It gets in the way. Next is the input hypothesis, which is the big one, I think. Basically, the idea is if we care about acquisition, how does it work? And the claim is this. A necessary but not sufficient condition to move from one stage of language learning, proficiency to the next stage is that the acquirer needs to understand input that contains language at that higher stage. So with structures that they don't know yet, okay? But they need to understand the meaning and be focused on the content and the message. Okay, so what you're doing is you're able to understand what's coming at you, but you can't explain the grammar of it. And a lot of it is stuff that's unfamiliar. This is also known as comprehensible input. Okay, Connected to this, so the idea is that if you are successfully communicating, then this process automatically happens. Because in successful communications, the input is understood, but there's stuff coming in that may not be familiar already or already mastered. And then connected to this is the idea that the ability to produce language emerges from this. Acquired competence provides the basis from which speaking ability develops. So on this theory, it wouldn't make sense to force people to speak Latin in a classroom early on, thinking that it's good for them. It would make more sense, if this theory is right, to give them lots and lots of input over time. And when they feel ready to speak, let them do it. Okay? And there are approaches that make use of this theory. This hypothesis, and here I'm quoting again, runs counter to our usual pedagogical approach. Our assumption has been that we first learn structures, so we learn them, and then practice using them in communication, and that's how fluency develops. So if there's any sort of validity to this, then that view gets completely undermined. And finally, there's the affective filter hypothesis, which I'll just say is basically there are certain other factors like motivation, anxiety, self-confidence, and that these affect your ability to acquire language when you're getting input. I think the big one is anxiety. In the classroom, there's oftentimes huge amounts of anxiety, and this would explain why people are not sort of getting the language as much as they would otherwise. Okay, so that's so those are the 5 hypotheses. I recommended looking at chapter 2 of Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition. I think it's pretty interesting. He gives a lot of the studies there, so you get a lot more of the details on how this works and why, how people can back out these theories. Okay, so I think that, like I said, this is just one theoretical basis that you can use, so you don't have to buy it. I think it's worth considering personally. But I think it has important implications. So if it's true or partially true, we really need to rethink what we're doing. For myself, when I first encountered this, I started thinking about my own experience as a student and a teacher. And it made a lot of sense to me because my reading ability really only picked up, I feel, after I came to graduate school. And what I did was, I was frustrated that I couldn't read Greek aloud properly. And I encountered this article, an old article by William Gardner Hale, where he talks about how to read Latin. And he poses the question, when reading a Latin text, when you could ask a student, okay, what's the first word that you look for? Okay, and some people will say, well, you look for the subject, and some people will say you look for the verb or the predicate. And then the author says, well, really, you should look at the first word. And then he goes on and says, what's the second word that you look for? Well, you look for the second word. And he talks about the system of reading where, if you see an accusative, some kind of, an accusative form in the first place, you hold it there and you say, okay, it's probably a direct object. If it's some kind of time word, it's probably an extent construction. But you suspend these things, and as you move forward, they fall into place, okay? And I think that made a lot of sense to me at the time, and so what I started doing was trying to read aloud and read texts from left to right, as opposed to sort of jumping around until I found something and then doing the puzzle game, right? And then I also tried to exclude as much English as possible from my thinking in the process, which is extremely difficult to do, and still now is very difficult. I think once you get into this habit, it's very, very hard to get away from it. So the Kentucky thing helped a lot, actually. I also thought about my experience taking German, because I took a German reading course, which I guess was also very grammar focused. But then I took the German sequence, like accelerated first year into second year sequence here. And they do a lot of stuff that's actually based on the theory that I just talked about, because I think, but it's sort of a mixture, but I could see elements of it. And I found it especially useful when the teacher would conduct class in German, because it provided a huge amount of stuff that I was hearing. My ear got better at listening to it. I felt like I was understanding things without having to think real hard about it. And so from that experience, I thought, well, this would be nice if something similar could be done with Latin and Greek. So that's sort of, I think that it's worth for yourself sort of thinking about this. The students you've seen, with your own experience, how do these things play out? Okay. To finish here, so I'm going to try to wrap up because I just wanted to put these things out there. I don't want to beat up too much on Keller and Russell, but here I pulled something from the preface. So it says, learn to read Latin grew out of an earnest wish to make available to others the immense pleasure we have both experienced in reading Latin literature in Latin. For many years, it has seemed to us that too much emphasis has been placed on teaching students to translate Latin, and that even the most diligent Latin students have attained too little intimacy with the Latin language and the styles of great Latin writers. Many beginning Latin books expect students to translate several volumes of stories in Latin written not by ancient authors, but by authors of the books themselves. So probably they're thinking of Oxford Latin course, Cambridge Latin course, Ecce Romani, and things like that, right? And perhaps even Orberg, the Lingua Latina per se illustrata. This seems to us an inefficient use of student energy and a pedagogical method of limited value if one's goal is to prepare students to read and appreciate Cicero, Caesar, Cicero, Livy, Virgil, Horace, and so many others. So I mean, this is a preface, right? You don't really go into a detailed argument. But I thought this was interesting. There are a few things that stood out to me about it. I don't know, does anything stand out to you about the way this is constructed and argued? I'm just kind of curious of something, what sorts of things. Yeah.
Well, I feel like we have a problem for both classics and Bible people in that learning the language is not the end goal. Learning it's being able to interpret these texts, which happen to be written in these languages that we don't know,
Right.
and so that seems to be driving this suspicion of reading unauthentic text.
Okay,
that,
yeah.
This is taking us away from where we want to get to.
Right.
And sort of, the goal, it's nice if you enjoy reading Latin, but really, we're not here to enjoy ourselves.
This also assumes a canon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Caesar, Cicero, Livy, Virgil, Horace, and so many others.
Yeah.
Where is your 16th century Latin writers? Where are your, I don't know how much there is of Latin documentary papyri, but I imagine there's some. So there's an assumption that you're going to learn to read specific authors to the exclusion of others, which is a mistake.
Actually, that makes me think that if this, on this view then, because if you want to read these authors, then you need to have a course that's structured around reading those authors, then this course would not prepare you then, on its own terms, to read other things, right? If that's, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, just the irony of it struck me, because I've learned and relearned Latin many times through many textbooks. So for them to say, prepare me to read and appreciate, Caesar, Cicero, Livy, I know that that's not going to happen, through their method. So just the irony of the goal to me struck me.
Because it's the same method, but it's done better though than a lot of other books. I think it's better than Wheelock, right? Yeah. Marcos?
So one interesting point is just that they begin by saying too much emphasis has been placed on teaching students to translate Latin, right, instead of reading. Then they say many textbooks have them translate stories in Latin that the authors have written.
Yeah.
Implies they should be translating ancient authors instead.
Yeah.
Right. So they don't actually tell you like how you're going to make the transition to reading. They say in some textbooks have you translate stuff A. We want you to translate stuff B, and then eventually you'll get to read it somehow.
Yeah, I think it's very sly what happens here because those books don't want you to translate; they want you to read. They do it, but some do it well, some don't do it so well. I think the reason I like Orberg and giving you the excerpt from it is because I think that this book does it very well, and it does it in a way where you're encouraged not to think in your native language. There's not a word of English in this book. Okay, it's maybe the copyright page, but if you pervert kind of the intent of these reading methods and say that you're translating all these stories and so forth, then yeah, sure. That's indefensible. I think a reading method where you translate all the time would be completely useless, actually, or not completely useless, but pretty useless. So anyway, I think that there are a lot of things here that I found. I thought it showed kind of what the standard view is and some of the assumptions. And I looked at I found it on Amazon with the excerpt from the new edition of Mastronardi, and he says things sort of along similar lines, like, this is a course intended for students who are serious about learning Greek and are willing to put in the effort to learn it properly, right? Which carries a lot of assumptions with it. So, here's just something from, there's this nice manual. So Luigi Miraglia is this Italian guy who runs a school there and used to be a school teacher, and he's been using the Orberg method for a while, so he really comes from the opposite end of the spectrum. And he wrote this manual where he talks about kind of what he thinks are the ways of using this course. I'll just read parts of this. He's saying that it doesn't, the course doesn't prevent you from learning grammar. It doesn't try to keep you from learning grammar. The criticism of grammar translation that's implicit in it is not that is not a matter of insufficient clarity. The problem consists in determining whether, in particular for children and adolescents, but not only for them, the systematic learning of the scientific description is the best way of learning the language, of mastering the rules that govern its function, not only in such a way as to be able to express them abstractly, but to convert them in succum et sanguinem, so that they become automatic reflexes, making possible without further reflection a fluent reading of the text with full comprehension. So this idea of, okay, it's not working well enough, so let's describe it even more clearly. Let's describe grammar rules more clearly. It's, that's going in the wrong direction. And here he talks about this usus versus doctrina distinction. The course teaches grammar and morphology more effectively by reversing the order of presentation so that usus precedes doctrina. The grammatical rule is first encountered in the text and inductively understood from its context, and then it is systematically ordered and schematized. Okay? If our goal is not for our students to acquire information about the Latin language without knowing how to use the language, even in its receptive aspects, we must avoid beginning with the rule as a prescriptive norm and then looking for its application in text and exercises. We must, on the contrary, bring an even greater degree of awareness that which has already been assimilated and understood in usage. So things that have been acquired, according to the theory. Okay, and then he says that you should really learn this grammar systematically or clearly at a second stage after you've done some acquisition. Okay, so those are just some contrasted views.
Alex, could you say what that would actually look like in a classroom? Because I find this fascinating, but I cannot imagine starting beginning Greek in such a way that you don't teach some grammar rules before you put a partial sentence or a phrase or a, I mean, do you need visual aids or, I mean, how do you do this?
You need lots of extra linguistic information, so context, pictures, things like that. It might actually be helpful if I can dig it up quickly.
I mean, is it a bit like a Rosetta Stone for...
I mean, sort of like that. I mean, in that it's using other things in order to get you started. I can show you here. These are scans from the book. Okay, so this is the first page of the textbook. And you're expected to read this. Obviously, you need help from the instructor to get pronunciation. But the way you can see how it proceeds. Roma in Italia est. Oh, sorry, you've had already, there's a map. So, okay, well, you're given this map, okay? You can see that. And you have that available to you, so it's on the facing page, basically. And then using this map, you then start reading the text, and it begins here. Roma in Italia est, Italia in Europa est, Graecia in Europa est, Italia et Graecia in Europa sunt. Okay, so you can see how it builds it up. This book is made in such a way that everything is taught through this method. So from what you've learned before, and then through these marginal notes, that's how you get explanations. Let's see. I guess if we look at here, I've given you on the handout. It's a good time to turn to that actually. On the third sheet, you see chapter section, chapter 6 from the book. Okay. And you can see that there's a lot of visual. There are a lot of visual aids here. There's the map of Italy. There's the close-up map here on the right side. There's an illustration of Amurus and Porta. And then even for prepositions on the bottom right, you see circum oppidum, right? And some attention has been drawn to the form because the is italicized. And if you turn to the next sheet on page 42, you can see that here we describe the master of the house, Julius, traveling, and you can see him and his slaves. And so what's described in that first paragraph corresponds to the picture. And then you have these motion things. opidum and wila in the left margin, ab opido ad wilam. So that's kind of how this would work. That's the method that he's talking about. That helps. This is what Miralia says about this method is he says, I've used this course for some years with exceptional results. Although confident in the abilities of my students, I would never have expected one day to see adolescents capable of reading correctly and effortlessly the Somnium Scipionis of Cicero. Still less would I have dreamed of hearing teenagers discuss in good Latin the weighty philosophical questions that the text raises. Nevertheless, to my satisfaction, I have been present at such scenes. So when he was a school teacher, that was what he was able to produce. So students who would read the text and then discuss it in Latin with paying attention to the content and the meaning. So I think, I don't know, do we suffer from limited expectations based on what we've encountered? I think maybe somewhat. Okay, so we can use this as a basis for discussion if people want to bring that up. But so you can see how the Orberg text works. On the first page, I scanned the corresponding items from Keller and Russell. So we have ablative of separation, ablative of cause. Well, that's not totally related to what we're talking about. Ablative of place from which, ablative of place where in the locative case, and then accusative of place to which. And we also get the nice rule, remember, rus, domus, small town, small island, and cities, right? Don't use the prepositions, but use these other forms, right? You memorize that and you practice it. Whereas in like a book like this, you just see it so many times that it becomes internalized. So. And then I found this very curious because I recently found out about this French series of language learning books called Assimil. And I guess this is more popular in Europe than in the United States. But I got a hold of the Latin edition that they have. The old Latin edition that they have is supposed to be pretty good. And they only have it for French and Italian speakers. So you can see kind of how this works. So on the final pages, here we have the 8th lesson. And basically it's a dialogue. And then on the right side, there's a translation in whatever your base language is. And you can see that, the pictures don't help explain the text. The translation is meant to serve that purpose here. So here you are relying on your base language. The pictures are just sort of funny because they recontextualize some of the text from the lesson. But the idea here is that you read the dialogue using the translation to figure out what it means. And then you're supposed to reread the dialogue and listen to it without thinking in your native language. Okay? So you do use your native language to sort of bootstrap the process to figure out what the text says, but then you just read the text over and over until you have gone through it a few times, then you move on to the next lesson. And after doing 50 lessons, then you do the next 50 lessons while redoing the first 50 lessons, going from your base language back to Latin. Okay? It's a really simple method, but I've heard good things about it, and I'm trying to learn Italian by it, and I think it's pretty fun, actually. It seems to be working well. So that's what I've given you here in these. And this also shows how it deals with expressions of motion towards or place where or motion from. Because he talked about traveling. Here you say, ubi estis et quo itis. Where are you and where are you going? In raida sumus, we're in the cart or the wagon, the car. Romam imus, we're going to Rome. So there you just have it, Romam imus. No one explains to you that means ad orem Romam or something like that, right? So those are three very different approaches, I think, that might illustrate something. So I guess we should probably open it up for discussion. And if people have questions or want to mention anything, to sort of kick things off, I'll just point out a few things that I consider problems. So there's that lingering question of motivation. There's time constraints. What can you do in the given time that you have? There's teacher training. How do we get to the point where we feel comfortable using other methods? Materials. So if you wanted to do an input-based approach to, say, Latin or Greek, are there sufficient intermediate materials? You need things that take someone from a very beginner level where they can read a lot of stuff that's not super boring to keep pushing them forward to higher levels. And with Latin and Greek, you need to try to find these things or you have to produce them, unfortunately. When people are learning English, right, they can watch TV, read comic books, read young adult fiction and things like that, right? There's a ton of stuff that you can use. Okay, there's also, I guess I put it as evaluation. But a major problem people have is if you're making the argument, oh, we shouldn't be focused so much on translation, the question is, well, how do you know that students are understanding what they're reading or what they're listening to? And if you don't use translation, how do you do that? That's a tough thing to do. I mean, people talk about various things like one thing you can do is have them read the original and then see whether they're able to read it in a way that shows they understand it. So the expressiveness of your reading can actually tell you a line. The other is to ask questions using the language, okay? Who is doing this, so-and-so is doing this, and have them respond in the language, okay? So there are ways to, or have them do paraphrases. There are a number of different things that people talk about, but that's a big problem. And then the last thing I'll say is basically, with all this, I think that we have to play a balance between theory and practice, right, as usual. So there are these various theories of language learning that come up. I sort of got into this by reading this book, How Languages Are Learned, which is really, it's like a basic handbook for teachers of languages. So it's actually quite a good introduction. And there's so many different ways of looking at this, different approaches, different hypotheses. And so I think, you need to have this approach where you can try things out, give them their fair shot in the classroom, see what you think about them. But anyway, I've probably talked too long, so I think we should maybe see if there are any questions or things that people want to talk about based on this. So.
Well, I just add just one thing to your list, and that would be like institutional constraints too. It seems like this would have to be a decision that your department would have to make, because you might teach introductions, year this way, but when they get to the second year or third year, they have to be able to talk about the language in certain ways and have the linguistic, categories. And other teachers may not appreciate your preparation.
Or if yeah, I mean, my plan is to go on and teach high school Latin because I want to try out things in that context. And if I say used this book, right, and send kids off to college, they wouldn't do that well because, I mean, all the grammar that you talk about is going to be in Latin, first of all, and then the grammar is not necessarily something you're doing from the very start, to the same thoroughness, right? So there's a question of what will happen in that transition.
So on this point, so you've taught, right, in the intermediate and beginning sequences here, and I think you've sprinkled in some of this, right, into your teaching, so you're kind of trying to work within the constraints.
Yeah.
What have you done, and how have you, what has that experience been?
Yeah, so actually I worked with Cassie last quarter, so she got to witness this process firsthand. So what I tried to do last quarter is to speak to an increasing degree in Latin, so to run the class in Latin. So it could be very simple things like, let's look at our books, let's turn to this page. Okay, so-and-so, please read the first sentence. Okay, let's move on, please read the next sentence, translated into English. And so these sorts of basic classroom things, just give them more input that they can understand. And they sometimes are confused, and so I'm not sure how best to do this, but they get it based on the context usually, or they'll just ask, right? So that's one thing I try to do. The other is, if you look at the readings that we have in here, some teachers are really big on going through all the readings, or at least paying attention to the non-poetry readings. So like here, you can probably see this. Here's something from Caesar, and the text is at the top. At the bottom, they've glossed all the words that they haven't memorized from the chapter vocab so far. And it's a lot of words, actually, right? Reading these things is very frustrating with students at this level. They have to look up so many words, and they really stumble through it. So what I did for that was I located, there are various beginner and intermediate level readings, usually from before the early 20th century. And so I found some of those that I liked. So there's Fabulae Facules by Ricci, and there's a good edition that was made of those for sight reading. And so I just had students read those as their supplementary reading. They're very easy, but they were still challenging enough, I think. I thought that they were funny. When I first encountered it, I read through all of them because I thought it was entertaining. And so I thought, well, okay, maybe that'll motivate them. But yeah, it's hard because you're constantly constrained by the pace of the book, and you feel compelled to teach them the things that are in the book. And so, I don't know. Yeah, so I've just tried to mix it things that way.
Can we go from that to the point about evaluation? Like, how do you go from that approach to evaluating students? Like what would What do your midterms look like?
Well, so I combined this with the second sort of thing where what I would do is for every quiz or exam, I would base it, the content would be based on the readings that we had done since the last exam. So if we had done, say, 4 or 5 of these snippets from the underlie apocalypse, I would say those form the basis for the next quiz. So the sentences that I present to you on the sentences of the passage that show up on the quiz will be based on those readings. And so it's fully contextualized, I think. Plus they know what the story is, they know a lot of the words, but I would still gloss things that aren't part of the vocab here. So that I would connect it that way. I mean, maybe you're asking something different though. Is that?
No, I'm just wondering, like, if you include any type of grammatical exercise at all, or if you completely go for readings.
Oh yeah, no, I would do grammatical exercises. So they still do the homework drills. Yeah, they would do the homework drills and we talk about those. Cassie would spend a lot of time grading them, I think, and then because there are so many of them. This quarter, we do spend time with that, but I try not to spend too much time. And what I do is, in those quizzes, I take that text, I rewrite it to use the grammatical constructions, right? So it's combining the two parts, the grammar exercises with the readings. But I don't know, it's hard to say how much success it's given. Yeah.
So one thing that brings up is I've never seen or been in one of these courses using a traditional method textbook where all the exercises were assigned and all the exercises were gone over. There's just not time to do that kind of thing. Do you know anything? Do you know anyone who has tried that and what sort of results that produces? Because I asked this because you were just mentioning that Cassie was doing all these things. Like one of the great things about learning to read Latin is that there are so many exercises. But does that?
I mean, if you were to do more exercises, would it provide some tangible benefit? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm asking. Yeah, do you have any sense of what the effect is? Do you know anyone? Has anyone discussed this? Because I mean, has anyone been in a class like that teaching an ancient language where there are, more than 10 exercises at the end of a unit, and you actually did like 20 or 30 exercises per unit?
I mean, I guess in high school. The great part, I mean, mostly in high school we had you probably too, didn't we?
Yeah, we did a lot of those.
But I guess not on the college level. Right?
Yeah. I mean, there's some instructors here who assign almost all the exercises in reading training, but
I still think that doesn't make the transition to reading proficiency.
Yeah, I don't think the drills.
I mean, I had years of Latin before I came here, and I feel like my reading proficiency. I mean, there was only like a breakthrough when I took Reginald Foster's class in Rome. We were just reading Latin intensively in a lot of it. So that, rather than exercises, I think, was responsible in my case for making the transition from knowing about Latin to being able to actually read it.
Yeah, you actually have to start doing it. It's, I guess people use the musical analogy a lot, right? You can describe how to play a violin or a piano in great detail and tell all about how it works and how it should be done. But if you try to sit down and do it, right, now you're faced with a completely different task. I think it might even be the same with writing. I think about being a freshman writing intern. Part of the problem with the students, I think a big part of it was that they simply hadn't read much of the kind of writing that they're expected to now produce, right? And for me, I think my writing emerged from just reading a lot. So, I mean, there are a lot of analogies that we could draw here, and I think that it shows that even if you keep pushing this method, right, of doing the drills and exercises and so forth, you might not be getting much out of it. So.
Yeah, it just struck me that, in the course of the past hours, I've been thinking in terms of first year courses and initial language instruction. What kind of, how would we rethink year 2 and 3, let's say, or the combination of the more intense literature reading with grammar review, for example, that helps, move from language learning to language proficiency. You know what I mean? Because a lot of these things are so basic that they're still grappling with the alphabet at that point. At least in terms of the pamphlet and some of the things we're doing. But I don't know. It strikes me that the real acceleration of proficiency happens much later, and this gets to the time constraints, so the institutional concerns. Do the theorists, do they think about, that 3rd and 4th year of language instruction and how that should change?
Yeah, I think that the trick is to find, if you were taking this approach where you wanted to have comprehensible input and readings that sort of scaled up over time, then what you would do in these post-beginner stages is try to have a wide range of readings available that are easy enough for students to get and also keep them interested. How you would actually organize that as a class, I'm not really sure. And then but something like that, where you're getting them to read a lot. Part of it could be everyone's reading the same thing. Part of it could be, here's a library of materials. Go ahead and just spend X amount of time reading each day or each class on your own. And then I would want to start incorporating more grammar instruction, which would be make them aware of things that they've seen enough, but then to make it explicit. Have them try to formulate what the rule is based on what they've seen or encountering in their past experience. And then this way gradually try to build up a more conscious awareness of the language as opposed to this proficiency. But I mean, what I wonder also is what can you get done in the first year? Because this goes to the time constraints issue, right? I think that students after 1 year, given, this is something I'd like to try out, right? Given an input-based approach, okay, what can you get out of students in 1 year? And I think that actually maybe you could get a decent level of proficiency out of them, but this is something I'd have to try out. But that's my suspicion.
Well, I'm just curious because for example, in the divinity school, a number of students will take Greek or Hebrew just for 1 year. Mm-hmm. And the real question is, what? 2/4 of grammar, the third with some reading. But the real question is, what do we expect them to do, to be able to do?
Yeah.
I mean, I assume the assumption in class 6 is they'll take it for more than 1 year.
Yeah.
Greek or Latin.
I mean,
I just find our own arrangement somewhat problematic if they don't ever encounter the language again.
Right, so the question is, given this very tight time constraint, what's the best you can get out of it? And one thing might be give them this grammar overview, so at least when they encounter things in the future, they can sort of pick it apart, right? And reading proficiency is just not a realistic goal. So that's one thing. I understand that, and in certain contexts, I think that's probably legitimate. Right? If that's all you've got and you have certain limited goals, then why not? I would say that this idea about not just teaching students the language, but teaching them to become language learners is probably one approach to this, right? If you say, we're going to go through the basics of this and build it up, and I'm going to explain to you why we're doing it this way and why it works, okay? So make them aware of what the process is, don't shield them from it. Maybe you'll get some pushback from some students, especially ones like most of us who like grammar and are wondering why don't you explain it to me. You have to play that balance. But I think if you make them good language learners and say, okay, from this point on, here are things you can do to continue developing, I think that might help. And if you have sufficient materials for them to work with, then this could work. Because one of the advice a lot of us in classics have gotten from one of our professors is, you should always read 20 minutes a day Latin and then 20 minutes of Greek. Anything, just read it for 20 minutes each day. Over the years, you'll see a huge improvement. I believe this. Actually, I think the old prescription was something like 30 minutes or an hour a day, right? But it's gone down so much frequently. And so I think that something along these lines could be a way of approaching it, right? We give them the beginnings, and we also teach them what they need to, or give them the right sort of attitude and awareness in order to make further progress. But what they come out with at the end of 2/4 is probably limited, right? In terms of actual language ability.
Do these theories take into account the learning styles of each student? For instance, some students are more conceptual, others are more experiential, intuitive. There are lots of theories about how many learning styles are out there. Like, how can we account for those into the teaching?
Yeah, there is a lot of discussion of this. I think especially the other excerpts are from this book on techniques and principles, which I think is useful because they basically they describe a lot of techniques, classroom techniques, like they'll use a mock-up of a classroom basically with a transcript or something, and then they'll break it down, right? What are the values and assumptions behind this technique? What are the different ways of approaching these kinds of issues, like general issues in language? And I think that they talk about this some here. And other people talk about it. It's not actually something, I haven't really thought too much about this personally, so I'm not really sure if I can say that, but I think it's an important issue. Like, how do because the problem here is that currently I think the approach that we take does appeal to a very small group of students. But we want to do something that appeals more broadly. But we don't want to cut other students out somehow along the way, right? So we want to make it work for a wide range. But actually that's something that I would like to think more about, but haven't really formulated clear thoughts about. Yeah.
Well, this is something that I've been thinking about for a while. You've touched on it, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. That the materials problem is really significant, right? That we don't have these intermediate and easy texts, and the main source, as you pointed out, is 19th century schoolmasters who've written their versions of these. But it seems to me there's another problem, which is that the classical vision of what texts get preserved and which texts ought to be read is elitist, right? It does want purposefully to focus on the harder, more sophisticated, more stylistically elaborated texts. And that, in fact, that's really important, right? I forget where I was hearing someone discussing this yesterday, that if you're going to learn Latin prose, you have to read Cicero because so many people base their prose on Cicero, right? And so I'm wondering how that affects our approach, right? Because if someone's going to learn Italian so that they can go and communicate in Italy, or so they can read Italian articles, right? They can really gear themselves towards those two goals, and they'll have sort of a different set of inputs that they'll get. In our case, we really want, what we're going to get people to is a fairly sophisticated stylistic set of criteria. And so that seems to me to put up another problem, which is that it's not just that the materials aren't there, it's that the materials that we do have resist what we're talking about here, right? That Xenophon is easy at Greek, but he's not easy, right? He's actually trying to write for adults who are going to be like, man, Xenophon's a really sweet writer, right? So, yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, no, I think that's a huge problem, right? I mean, I also think if there are books like easy readings from Plato or something like that. Students who have just done who have just done a year of Greek to read Plato, they'll hate it. I think that's why I think that these so-called artificial texts there's nothing wrong with that. If you find a good reader, like I guess the Moss reader, for instance, for Greek, people like that. I think that's fine. Or there are other non-canonical or sort of semi-canonical authors who you maybe could read instead. And then I think a lot of work needs to be done to just make additions for students that take this into account. To go back to the Warburg series, which I like very much, what he does is he has the first book, and then from that basis, there are numerous other books you can use. So you can read Plautus, you can read Caesar, you can read Petronius, you can read an old sort of summary of the Old Testament. There are a lot of things that you can do based on just the first textbook. So there would be a first year course, and then it's up to the students or the teacher to decide what to do then. Or there's the second year, or the second part of the course too that you could do, which gets you up to Cicero and Livy and guys like that, and Virgil. So you have a lot of options, and what it does is you build up the basis and then you branch out. So I think that helps. You have more editions like that, and those are meant to be, per se instructive, right? So they're supposed to work along the same lines, so they wouldn't be too difficult.
I think one way to address that problem would also be to incorporate more post-classical Latin, because there's a lot of post-classical Latin, like Erasmus. People try to imitate Cicero, but there's also a lot of Latin that was just written for daily consumption, right? Just, convey a message, and I think we are underexploiting that resource. And one of the problems, again, is there's not enough good editions of that. So you have to find those texts, evaluate them, write notes for them ourselves, and that is, of course, a huge input of our time.
Yeah.
And I think that would be valuable if we could get some good editions of post-classical Latin that's unpretentious, just daily communicative Latin.
Yeah, and I think, I mean,
I'm still waiting for it to come out. Maybe I should just do it myself.
Erasmus is, I think, a good example because a lot of these texts are meant for students. They're sharp and they're witty, but the language is not going to be too hard, right? And so, like the colloquia, for instance, are perfect for this. So, like a good student addition to that, I think, would be very welcome.
No, to follow up on that, like something I had learned from like Reggie Foster was he had used a lot of like short self-contained texts. So something like Frontinus where they're small and anecdotal. So I looked for like, I used one of my students, I had a Latin tutoring. I had done like the Apophthegmatum Patrum in Latin because they're like a sentence or two at most, very simple. You can find them in mini, I just make some photocopies. And vocabulary is it's mostly Christian, but it's pretty repetitive. So that was very good for sight reading. Just like a lot of medieval texts, like saints' lives, I found were very good. The sentences were pretty short and they had repetition, and some of them are just really fun, like converting prostitutes and stuff, and cross-dressing homeless and all that sort of stuff. So that people are interested in the narrative. So that was good. And then I found you could bridge that into Frontinus or something like that. So that was something that I had found.
So the thing that keeps striking me throughout our conversation today is this distinction that we've drawn between translating and reading. And I think that this is something probably we've all come up against, especially if anybody's crammed for a German or French reading exam. But there seems to be a conflation, I think, that I don't think we taught like is addressed directly in that, it's not the same thing. They're two different skills. Being able to read, and I think you've talked about it very well today, like without thinking in your own native language, and then being able to translate that text. And this isn't a fully formed question, just kind of something that I've struggled with and would love to know any thoughts you have. But, I think about in Hebrew Bible, in class, that's what we do. We go around the room, we read aloud in Hebrew, and then you translate. And I think that's what you need to prepare students to be able to do. This gets to the institutional kind of expectations, because that's what they're going to be asked to do. But at the same time, there's also another layer there. They're two different skill bases, I think, entirely. I mean, they're related, obviously. But how do you get at that early on and, as going forward?
No, I think that, so one of the things you need to do is you want students to be able to produce a translation eventually.
Right.
You don't want to keep them away from that. And I guess maybe some of you who remember when Harm Finster was here teaching, he would translate things, and he's not a native English speaker. His translations into English are excellent. They're amazing. And what he does is he's doing exactly what I think you should do. He understands the Latin completely, and then he produces a formulation of it in English. Whereas what most students end up doing is they have the Latin, and you take a word, English, another word, English, another word, English, and now let's play with the English, right? So English with grammatical features attached to the words, right? And so what we want to do is get away from that, where you're using it as sort of this crutch to help you understand the text, but to where you develop the understanding and then are able to reformulate it into English or whatever target language, right? So I think that takes a lot more effort and a lot more care, but I think it's worth it. I think that's what we should be doing. I think there's a question back there.
I was just curious then, because our Hebrew Bible students are very encouraged to study modern Hebrew, because for all the reasons that we're discussing, it's such an aid to our acquisition of the text, even though they're very different languages. They're both Hebrew. And does that play a factor in Greek at all, or with regard to? If we're going to overcome this prejudice of dead languages, why not study the very much alive languages that are available to us?
I think with Latin, there's a very easy case to be made for treating it as a living language. With ancient Greek, it's harder to read because it did actually have this period of dying out.
Right. So same.
But Hebrew has been applied, so I don't know.
It's based on.
It's very closely based, so there's going to be a strong connection. I think there's also the pronunciation issue for modern Greek and ancient Greek. That's for those of us in classics who do this restorative pronunciation, right? It's very, very different from modern. But then, I guess I heard that people who are native Greek speakers find learning ancient Greek a lot easier. They have all these problems that we do. So maybe it would be helpful. I don't know.
One thing I can say, having studied modern Greek as well, is I learned ancient Greek first and then did modern afterwards. But when I was in Greece and working on my modern Greek, it helped a lot with the alphabet, which is a huge stumbling block to a lot of students learning Greek and trying to teach them. Like constantly a second level of decoding. They're not just doing translation in English and then trying to understand English, but also first decoding from the alphabet, the Latin alphabet in their head. And learning the modern language, if nothing else, sort of made that, for me, completely disappear. It would be automatic. Where I was just seeing the sounds, right? I was looking and trying to look through it. That was useful.
But I think, even in just a plain ancient Greek classroom, I think that you should be able to get students to where the alphabet is not even something they're consciously caring about anymore. And we want to do that, but actually, for whatever reason, a lot of students don't get to that point, right? And
Sure. Well, it's about bulk of text, right?
Yeah,
When you start with modern Greek and you have the sort of modern style of, what are you talking about? Where you're reading a lot, right? You get a newspaper article in front of you, you don't understand all of it. You work on it, and work on it, and work on it. You just read bulk of stuff. And when you're doing one sentence at a time and then stopping to talk about the grammar, you're not reading enough.
Yeah, like in Master Marty, if you look at the sentences that one reads, the amount of reading material one has, it's very little to start out. So you need more to be seen the question.
Yeah, so the idea that one should include different texts in the teaching of Greek and Latin than the classically canonicized ones, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I cannot imagine that your idea or the idea of Miralia or Orberg would be that these should replace what is the goal of this whole process now, i.e. Cicero, Virgil, and so on.
Right.
So I think my sense is that you would want to read them, I don't know, not as the end goal, but at some stage along the process, right? So where could you see how you see that? I don't know, in a 2 or 3 year program, when would these texts come in, and what would their connection be to what people mentioned in that preface with Virgil and Livy?
So if I tried to it would require more classroom sort of work to figure this out more clearly. But I wouldn't expect my students, either in college or high school, to be reading unadapted Cicero before their 3rd year. But I would want them to get there eventually. I would aim to have them there by their 3rd year. Right? So I think that you would need a lot of this intermediate adapted or really easy stuff to get them there. And not try to push it too quickly, which will just frustrate them and make them fall on bad habits. So that's my rough estimate. But I think you're right that these texts should not replace the other texts that we're trying to get to. We want anyone who's a competent sort of user of Latin to be able to read Cicero and to do it with ease, regardless of what you're. So we do want to get there, and I think that the Orberg texts are good because they do that. In the main text series, he adapts. So in the second book, which is quite a bit bulkier, he adapts a lot of Virgil and a lot of Livy and Cicero, and eventually by the end of it, you're reading unadapted stuff, right? But you've made it step by step, and every new thing has been explained or illustrated through use, not through any sort of consciousness. Sure.
Yeah, and I think the hope would be with your method, the things we're discussing now, by the time they do read that Cicero in their 3rd year, they would be able to just fly through it. They would know it so much better than the students who haltingly and painstakingly spend their 2nd and 3rd years reading something and a lot of them having a really terrible and frustrating experience spread over 2 years. You could probably read as much in that 1/3 year and have a much more greater depth of comprehension.
I've never experienced that in a classroom myself, but I've heard reports of it, and I think I can see why that would work. And so that's, I'd certainly like to try for that.
I'm wondering about this reading, translating thing, and your earlier comment about the analogies with music. And thinking that once you get to a complex level in music and you're playing, say, a piano concerto or something, you take the time, you write down fingering, you often learn one hand at a time, and it's only after weeks, sometimes months of practice, you get to a point where it's so internalized that you can just play. And I've never seen this done in a classroom, I don't know if you have, but I feel like here at Chicago and our model is to throw a wide range of texts or a bunch of stuff. So every week we're sight reading, we're just learning enough to be able to get through it in class, and then we have something new. Have you ever done something where you would sit with the one text but you'd actually just reread it until it becomes somehow internalized? Or I mean,
Well, I think, so memorization is one way to do that. I think.
Yeah.
And I've had teachers who would make us memorize passages, and I try to do, well, I thought about doing it this year for my students, and then I realized I should just make it extra credit, and then maybe 2 out of 12 students would take it up and do it. But I think memorization is the way to do that, right? Because if you pick, good passages, you memorize them, you can play them over to yourself as much as you want, and sort of, let it become fully internalized. I think that's really useful. And I think also, one of the really horrible things that happens is that we do exactly what you described, where you read a lot of stuff, you take all this effort to figure out what the text says, and then you move on.
And you read it once.
Yeah, you read it once.
Yeah.
Whereas what you should do is, once you've figured out what the text says, you should read it again and again and again after that, because it's otherwise not going to get internalized. You're really actually not getting any benefit from it. It's just a big waste of time, I think. And so, maybe you've figured out some new rules or tricks that you can use along the way, but actually having it so that next time you encounter something similar, you get it automatically. I think you really need to do this review process to get to that point. I try to encourage my students to do that, but I haven't really figured out a way to test them on it or strongly.
Yeah, I remember being told that's what you should do in your own preparation for class, so you've read it many, many times, but with time constraints, we don't do that for most of us. But classrooms also don't facilitate that to happen, so I'm wondering how we can do that in classrooms.
Well, so one tactic that I have is this thing with the quizzes, where I said, we've read these parts of the stories, and then now your quiz is based on those passages, so you might want to reread those. And so what I'm trying to do there is to trick them into rereading the passages so that they get more benefit out of it, and then they also study for the exam. So, do better.
So the conversation has moved on, but I was thinking about this issue of translating versus reading, and I'm not honestly sure that it's realistic to expect people to read right off the bat. You give them very easy things, because I know I studied Spanish for 5 years in high school, and that was all spoken and inductive, and classes were led in Spanish, and it was several years before I could stop thinking in English and just think in Spanish. And it may have been 4 years, 5 years, it may not have been until I was in Mexico and speaking it full time. And so I wonder whether there's just a time component. I'm prepping for my comps right now, and I just hit the point with my Hebrew where I can just read and not translate. But I've been reading Hebrew for 5 years at this point. And I wonder if that's not, it surely has something to do with the pedagogy, but it may also just be an issue of how much time you have to spend with the language.
And so you're saying when you would hear or read at those early stages, you felt that translation was necessary to understand what was happening.
And that even with Spanish, where I had learned it in this very different way, it was a quick step, but I still had to translate from English into Spanish in my head before I could speak. For several years before I could just speak Spanish without thinking English first.
The problem when I think about that, for me thinking about it, is that I don't have enough experience with modern languages to have tried this out for myself. The only real substantial thing I could say is, well, German I learned it through this reading method first, so that sort of screwed that up. And then I took Arabic for a while, but here it's done in a very grammar-heavy approach, so it wasn't done at all like this. And then the only thing I have is the Italian, but I've gone through maybe 35 lessons so far in this book series I was mentioning. And yeah, sure, you use the English to figure out what the Italian says. But then from just rereading the Italian, like reading it to myself, listening to the audio recordings and stuff like that, I don't have to think in English and it makes sense to me. So I think that because it just scales up so slowly, right, and then there's all this repetition involved of the same material, I find it really helpful, and I feel like I'm making progress, so it's sort of fun in that way. So but that's the only data point I have on that, right? I think that it could be that, some people are, tend to go more quickly with this sort of just getting it somehow, and for other people it tends to gestate longer or something like that. I'm not sure, actually, so that's...
Well, just reading what you gave us in your packet about the different methods, right? So there's, I think, kind of traditional grammar method, there's a direct method where no English was spoken in the classroom, it was all, you're writing on the board, you're drawing pictures on the board, and there's total physical response where it's more interactive, stand up, sit down, and again, There's no English, right? And I was just thinking about how that might apply to ancient languages and how we do it. And there's a concept in the science community that's quite popular, the flipped classroom. Where you kind of the classroom is flipped in such a way that you don't go to class to hear the lecture. You do the lecture outside of class, like you watch the lecture online or whatever. And what class is for the homework sessions. That's where you're practicing your learning in front of the instructor and very much more interactive. And I was thinking about if we could do language instruction in similar fashion, where you do kind of nuts and bolts grammatical work, kind of you can read textbooks and grammars outside of class and still preserve in class and have in class time being the much more kind of direct method and total physical response. Because I was trying to think of ways to kind of blend the methods in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, I like that way of doing it. I mean, if you have to stick with blending, then I would go for that. And I mean, I think Bart, I think you did the
That's
serial
pretty much
line.
what I did last quarter for my classes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think
spent
that
about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and actually discussing the grammar in class,
Mhm.
expecting that, and I mostly structured around the questions I got from the first reading of the grammar, and I think that were reasonably well.
Yeah, so I mean, when I remember teaching Latin over the summer one year, and I think that I did a very poor job of it, and I feel bad for the students now that I reflect on it. Because what I did was I would read the Keller and Russell chapter, and then I didn't want to just say the same thing that was in there, so I'd sort of think about it, and then I'd present the material in my own way of doing it. And then I'd spend a lot of the morning class lecturing on the stuff, and give some examples. I'd look up some examples from this grammar and that grammar and so forth. And I don't think they got much out of that. And so I do what Bart's talking about, which is you have a homework assignment to do. Here's the reading. So just read through what the textbook says. It's very thorough, right? If you need to know the rules, they're all there. And then do the exercise, and then we'll talk about any questions. And so it's this sort of a flipped approach, actually. And then you clean up afterwards with any questions and things like that. I find that leaves a lot more time for reading and other things in class, and I like that. And it doesn't seem like the students aren't getting the grammatical constructions. I think they're getting them as well as they did in the past, from my experience. So I like that. Yeah, Bart?
I'm wondering, a lot of us seem to report that they came to sort of breakthrough in language learning after a period of full immersion. If you're experiencing in Kentucky, my experience at the Reginald Foster program, which was 8 weeks doing Latin every day, right? And that's how most people become fluent in modern spoken languages too. You just go to the country where the language is spoken, and they come back, well, not exactly fluent, but more fluent than before. So I'm wondering if we should make more room in our instruction of so-called dead languages for periods of immersion. Even if it's just a day or 2 days in which, there would be nothing but Latin so that people would start thinking about it.
Yeah. So
maybe that's ambitious, but...
So in a normal class, we could take a week or a day of the week as an immersion day.
Yeah, I'm wondering if say a couple of days of full immersion is more valuable in the same amount of time spread out. There must have been research on this that I don't know about this immersion, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts.
Well, I think that's, I like the immersion approach, obviously. So I think that if you structure it in a way that makes sense, right? I've argued with Tobias about this before, right? In Kentucky, a lot of people go there just to speak Latin because they think it's fun, right? And that's not necessarily useful. I think that if you go there and you spend a lot of time listening to good speakers, you get a lot out of it. And if you try to communicate with them to get them to speak to you, you get a lot out of it. But if you're just sort of playing around or whatever, you're getting something, but not necessarily a lot. So I think that when you do immersion, it has to be done in a way where you think, how is immersion actually contributing to language acquisition? And then do that. But I would certainly like to do that in classrooms if possible.
We should have an opportunity to break. So it is past time, but please stay and have further conversation with Alex. And let's thank Alex.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.